Hello and welcome to the Emotional World podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. One of the things that I did at the start of 2018 was promise that we would introduce a new aspect to the podcast. So we'd introduced an aspect around emotion at work in stories. So I started that off by telling you my story from 2017, or the story of my 2017. And our guest today is here to talk about emotion at work in imposter syndrome. So, in a way, our guest sort of reluctantly volunteered to be our guest. So, anyway, let's get them on the air to start with. So, welcome to the podcast, the wonderful Amanada Arrowsmith.
Good morning. Hello. How are you?
Good. I'm good, thank you. I'm good. What about you? How are you doing?
I'm really well. Yeah, it's beautiful and sunny. It's cold, but beautiful and sunny. So, I'm in a good place.
It is crisp today, actually. Have you got a fire in your house? Because you're in the countryside, aren't you?
We do. We have a fabulous log burner that we didn't put on last night, despite the fact it was quite cold. I was under a blanket, but we also we have, where we live in the village, we have a biomass heater for the whole village.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. So the guy who runs our village, a couple of years ago when he took over, put biomass heating in for the whole village. So
wow.
Yeah. So I have put the heating on both upstairs and downstairs today, much to the dog's delight.
I haven't lit the fire yet today. It's something I will do because it's similarly crisp and cold where I am. But yeah, I haven't lit it yet today. I was wondering if you'd lit yours.
But as a fair-haired, freckled ginger woman, I love this weather because you get the benefit of the sun and the vitamin D and all that great stuff, but you don't actually have to get hot and sweaty.
Yes, that's true.
This is perfect for me.
Perfect weather for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so as well as being our guest then, Amanda's a HR practitioner, and we'll hear more about your experiences personally and professionally, if that's all right, as we work our way through the podcast. So before we get into kind of talking about our topic at hand today, one of the things that I do on all the podcast episodes is I ask a sort of unexpected / random question that takes us off into other topics that go from there. So is it all right if I open with that question?
Yes, of course.
Wonderful. So, I had a different one planned, and then our opening discussion has made me change it. So, is there or in your experience, is there a ideal way to light the log burner?
Yes, I believe there is. So,
okay, tell me what that is then.
I think you need to clear your grate a bit. So I don't believe you have to have it clear completely every time. You can have a couple of ashes in there, but you need to clear your grate because oxygen and moving air through is important. Don't over tighten your paper. I think you need to screw your paper up, but don't put it too tight, because you put it too tight, you end up putting too much paper in. But also don't overfill your paper. You have to find that great balance between paper, kindling and logs. I don't use firelighters. We have a very good drawer on our fire, so I don't have to use firelighters. But if we do use firelighters, we use the natural ones, because I can't stand the smell of those paraffin ones. Yeah. And you can't get it off your hands. It doesn't matter what you do. And also, remember to have your grate open. Don't do that thing where you close it and your vents are still closed, so your fire doesn't get going. But the other thing is small logs to start off with. It's always tempting to put a massive big log on to get your fire going. But actually, if you want to get heat going, the smaller the logs, the more heat you're going to get. The larger the logs, they'll burn longer and they'll burn stronger, and you'll get a nice constant heat, but you won't get that really, really hot heat. I am a log burner nerd, as you could now tell.
You are a log burner nerd. That's good.
Well, there's the type of logs as well, Phil. Let's not forget.
Oh, okay.
So you've got your hardwood, your softwood. Are you going to have a mix? Different wood burns are different. You want kiln dried?
I was going to say, do you do kiln dried? We don't do kiln dried. We do. We get ours from a provider that just kind of leaves them out in the sort of dry, but just leaves them out in the open rather than kiln dried.
We have a mix. So we got ours from. They deliver by the cubic metre here. They don't deliver by the bag or by weight, because obviously depending on how much moisture is in your logs are going to weigh more. So it's the drier your logs you want to deliver by cubic feet. Drier you probably want weight, but cubic feet is important because then you get the number of logs rather than the weight. But you want a little bit of dryness, otherwise they're going to get harder to burn.
Yeah, we get logs delivered by the ton. So, so we'll get a ton of logs delivered, and then we've got a massive log store that we'll put it in. So as well as being kind of dried by the person that provides the logs, we'll then put them in the log store and leave them outside. So a ton of logs will probably last us a year, I would say. So I say a ton of logs would last us a year, which is good. But we have an open fire, so rather than a wood burner, we've got a fully open fire, which I know is less efficient, but I love it. I love the ambiance of it, as well as the heat that it provides. But also, we've got our chimney in the middle of our house, so if we light the fire and then we have it on all day, then it burns. It burns really well all day, and it also, as well as burning really well all day, it will also heat the whole house because the chimney's right in the middle.
And so we're lucky like that. Our wood burner's below our bedroom, and when it gets at night when we go up, it's nice and toasty in our room. But if you happen to be at the other end of the house, because we're in a long kind of old barn shape, if you happen to be at the other end of the house, it's freezing.
It's freezing because you don't get the joys of it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think we've established that both of us are in the sticks. So yes. One of the challenges with being in villages is that the internet connection can't be all that great sometimes. So one of the things that we often do on the podcast is try and get the kind of podcast recorded in one hit without any editing, so we have a sort of a genuine exploration of the conversation. But if we lose our audio or anything like that, then we'll just we can always pause the recording, or we can come back and edit stuff back together if that's okay.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So, I guess I wanted to open with what went through your mind as you were putting your hand up to kind of say, I'd be interested in doing an Emotion at Work in Stories podcast.
So amusingly, I started with, I can do Emotion at Work podcast. I'd be happy. And then immediately I went to, but there'll be better people than me. There'll be other people with more information. There'll be other people who've got qualifications. There'll be people with better experience. Oh, he won't want me. There'll be other people. That'll be fine. But, I like a chat. That'll be good. So I had that internal kind of, but I'm probably not good enough. He'll probably have better people.
And how long has that been with you, that kind of internal dialogue?
So I think I've had that most of my life. I'm a younger sister of a really successful, clever, talented big brother. Okay. And he got really good grades at school. He got the lead part in school plays. He could write music and play music, and I couldn't do any of those things. He was firstborn. He still is firstborn. I'm talking about he's still around, bless him.
I was going to say,
yeah. And he was the apple of everyone's eye. And I was me, who was a little bit awkward, a little bit clumsy. I was Mr. Bump for many years at school. When my first school, Mum jokes about how she used to bump into people in the village we lived at the time, and they'd say, "Oh, we've seen you, Amanda, down the doctor's again," because I'd have fallen over at school and bumped my head or broken my arm. I wasn't I wasn't a perfect child. I always had a tear in something, and probably, as I say, bruises and bumps and those sorts of things. So I could never live up to our kid. I could never live up to him. He is one of my best friends. He's someone who I love beyond measure, and I know now that for many years he had the same feeling. And he's older than me, but in his 20s he would say things like, "When I grow up, I want to be like Amanda." So,
wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the perception we have of ourselves, isn't it, and what we feel. I think the other thing for me was I left school without qualifications at 19 after quite a bad illness when I was 15, and then many years of struggling to be academic again, having been one of those people who actually found school quite easy and learning quite easy. Okay. To then miss a year through ill health and never get that cognitive ability back again was really tough. So I went into work, and all my friends went to university, because that's what you did when you went to St Bartholomew's in Newbury. That's what everyone did. You went to university, you didn't go to work. And so there was the whole thing of what's culturally accepted. And so I always felt that I was not enough, and that I was slightly lesser, just because of the way that the path that my life took. And that kind of stays with you through life, doesn't it? It stays with you professionally. all the jobs that I couldn't apply for because they required a degree. If I'd done a degree in fine art, could I have applied for those jobs? Would it have made me any better at the job? Probably not, but I couldn't apply and they weren't interested in seeing me.
Yeah, because you didn't have that tick that you could put in the appropriate box.
Exactly. Through to not being able to have children. Unfortunately, I can't have children, and it's something that for many years it felt like a failure, and it felt like, but you know, with hindsight and a little bit of reflection, it's not a failure. Unfortunately, I'm physically not able to, and that's sad. You know, failed relationships, friendships that you invest in, you spend time in that disappear, and you spend. And I don't think this is just me. I think a lot of people do this, and I envy to an extent people that don't have this issue. You're always going to be going, what did I do? How was I not enough? What was it about me? And that element of self-doubt and how we doubt ourselves and the toll that can take on the way that you live and your emotion and the way that you work. So I guess I would say that probably from the age, I probably always had an element of self-doubt. I would say that I probably felt it more from my mid-20s when I started to try and achieve more at work, but couldn't because of my circumstance and my history.
Okay. So, and if at any point I ask questions that you don't want to answer or you're not comfortable going there, that you can just say that's okay. So what? So what made it more? I can't remember the word you used now. When you said, so you said it was more. I want to say the word pronounced, but that wasn't the word that you used in your mid-20s. What you mentioned it that you think it was around the time where you started to want to apply for more stuff. Was that right? Yeah, definitely.
I think it in human resources particularly, and you know, we said I'm an HR practitioner, and in the field of human resources, I'm a generalist.
Okay.
This would have been the mid-90s, and I would say still now, a lot of organisations, if you wanted to apply for a job, required a degree.
Yeah.
Interestingly, actually, if you go and look at the number of people that did degrees in human resource management in the late 80s and early 90s, it's probably quite low. So it wasn't a degree in my chosen field or vocation, but they wanted a degree.
Yeah.
And so at the time, the way that recruitment was working, and recruitment worked in this way with everything, CVs would be looked at and they would just be discounted. And if you didn't, as you said, tick that box, you'd get discounted. And it was disheartening. And so I got to a point where I just didn't apply for things because I knew that actually I didn't have the experience to be able to show that actually I didn't need a degree because I have the experience to do the job. But I also didn't have that tick in a box to show that I could do the activity. And this wasn't for jobs that required a particular skill. This was for personnel officer, HR advisor, junior HR manager, HR business partner roles. It wasn't, and so as recruiters, I think we got a bit lazy in that we tick must have degree. But actually what we meant by that was must be from a certain background, must fit a certain mould. Because actually by saying must have degree, what we were saying was must be white middle class.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that's a big leap, but
if you think about society at that particular time, and if you look to the demographics of people that would be able to get to and sustain being at university, I don't think that's maybe it's an overgeneralisation, but I think it's a reasonably fair generalisation to make. So I'm a little bit curious around. Was it that you were applying for jobs and you were getting knocked back, or was it that because of your kind of the roles that you were doing, you could see that CVs were being discounted on the basis of it, and therefore you didn't? So I guess I'm wondering, like, was it that you were doing stuff and getting rejected and that was compounding it, or were you seeing the practice and then that was compounding it, or was it something different?
It was a bit of both, actually. So I have recollection of conversations with recruiters where they'd say, no, client must have a degree on this.
Okay.
But also I was working, so late 90s, for 3 years I worked for a law firm in Leeds, and I loved it. I loved working there. It was great. It's where I did my IPD, as it was at the time, because that's how long ago it was. And we would look at paralegals, we'd look at secretaries, we'd look at, I think law firms and professional services are particularly hierarchical in terms of their education anyway.
Yeah.
I think about how we used to select trainee solicitors. Not only did they have to have a degree, but it had to be a degree from a Russell Group university, and it had to be a 2-1. At the time, we didn't really look at anyone else. And so I think I was within a structure where the importance on qualifications was so high that it probably highlighted my lack of qualification even more.
Okay. And then if I may, I want to then take a similar themed question, but then kind of go back to one of the things you said towards the start of the podcast about your brother. So I guess a similar question, was it that kind of you were trying to live up to that and being told that you weren't able to, or was it that you were telling yourself you weren't able to? Was there something different?
So he has a first class degree.
Okay.
He has a master's. It's in creative arts, and but he has these things, and I think it was more around the doors that were open to people that had a degree and could tick that box, and what that actually meant. And I think if I'm completely honest, I was bitter. I was bitter about the fact that the reason I didn't go to university was because I'd been ill. It wasn't about the fact that I didn't have the capability to go to university. It was, if we take away the cognitive ability, but you think about the mental, so actually the ability to learn and the ability to reason and the ability to research. If I could have spent the time reading and spending the time doing that, then I could have done all of that. It was more about. So I think I was a bit bitter, and I was a bit angry about the fact that I didn't do that, and I felt that I wasn't being given a chance to show my worth because of this perceived lack of something, because I hadn't gone to university. Because at the same time, I wasn't telling people that the reason I didn't go to university was because I'd been ill, because it wasn't acceptable. Because if you admitted that you had, I'm skirting around illness. I have ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's I added extra syllables into that. Encephalitis, myalgic encephalitis. At the time, it was known as yuppie flu, or chronic fatigue syndrome. So, if it comes with that horrible label, it's not seen as a real illness.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So you're not going to tell people you've got it, and you're not going to say, and this is the reason I didn't go to university, and this is the reason I didn't complete my A levels. I chose to talk about the boom and bust crash at the time, talk about the fact that my parents were on the income level where they earned too much to get a grant but too little to put 2 kids through university at the same time, talk about the costs and the reasons why because I didn't know what my vocation was going to be. I didn't go to university because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, but it was easier for me to talk about the reasons being external for not going than internal. But what you create stories, don't you? And you create reasons for yourself for not doing things. But there's the self-doubt through not getting opportunity, and then the narrative you start giving yourself. It's like, well, I couldn't do that because I don't have a degree. I could never be this because I don't have this. I could never do that because of this or because of that. And you close doors to yourself, and you close opportunity to yourself by doing that.
It's triggered me thinking about why, because I never went to uni either, so I've pretty much flunked out of my A level. So I didn't fail. Well, did I fail them? No, I didn't fail them because I got 3 E's. So I just about passed them. But in terms of actually then taking those 3 A levels and doing those 3 E A levels and then doing something with it. I was like, you know what, I don't want to, because I sailed through my GCSEs without any real effort or energy. No revision. I was late for an exam because I was playing football and it was 9-all. I wanted to see who was going to win. So it didn't take me any. There was very little cognitive effort in it. But when it came then to doing my A-levels, I thought I could just do the same, and I couldn't. I thought I could just rock up and answer some questions and I'd be all right, and I didn't. And I remember the blaseness of when I kind of opened my results and went, oh look, I got 3 E's, I'm off to the pub with my friends, see you later, and just kind of walked out the house. Because and then I created this story about why I didn't want to go to university and it wasn't the right place for me and that sort of stuff. And I still maintain that was, and I would say this because it's my life and it's turned out all right, but I still maintain not going to uni was the best thing I ever did. Because if I had done, I'd have just ended up getting stupidly in debt, drinking far too much alcohol, and coming out with nothing to show for it at the end of it. Because I was far too interested in drinking alcohol and meeting girls and playing with my friends and having fun than I was in doing anything vaguely resembling study. But there's definitely some stories that I've told myself over time since then as to my reasons for doing or not doing it.
Yeah. And those stories that we tell ourselves, they start forming the truth, don't they? So
absolutely,
you kind of you lose the actual truth because we rarely sit down and go, oh, actually, what did I do during that time? And what I did was, when I look back and I look at what I did, I joined the civil service. I went to work at the Serious Fraud Office. I spent a year in a press office at the Serious Fraud Office. Just to put a little bit of context around this, we had a shared email account, which I used to dial up every morning, every lunchtime and every evening, wow. Because we didn't have that, So for anyone who didn't start work until the 2000s, the 90s were fun. We used to fax things. I made some friends and did some things at 19 that formed who I am later in my life and formed what I did. I stayed in the civil service. I moved into the health service. I did a lot of work around patient advocacy and patient complaints. Okay. I then worked for a community health council, which at the time was around helping patients to access services and helping them to formulate their opinions on services. I did a public consultation on the University College London Hospital. I was part of the public consultation on the new UCL in London. I also did a public consultation on access to abortion services in North London and worked with the local health authority to avoid sending 16-year-old girls out to Mile End on the tube to have an abortion when actually they could get one in London, subject to... So, at the time we had 36 different languages being spoken in Camden. We had massive issues with drugs, which they still have. And I look back and I kind of go, oh, actually, do you know what? I did all right in those first 6 years of my working life, and I did some really good work. But at the time, I was looking at my friends who are at university, other people around me, and what I hadn't done and what I hadn't achieved and why I hadn't. And it's not until you kind of take that time to go back and appreciate that you can look. And, hindsight's a wonderful thing and all that stuff. But I don't think we as humans spend enough time going, do you know what? I did all right. And I did this stuff and I did that stuff. And I think that's that self-doubt thing as well, because I can't have done all right. Because if I'd done all right, then I wouldn't be feeling like this now, would I?
Yeah. And I want to come back to that last point in a second. But what I find really interesting about all of those things that you just sort of explained about the different roles that you've had, there was a real theme in that, right? Finding a voice for people, whether that be patient advocacy, patient consultation, 16-year-old girls needing an abortion. You were, everything you were doing was about finding a voice for people, and yet almost in a way you weren't. Your own voice. You weren't finding your own voice. I don't know if that's a fair thing to say, but I've said it now. So
I think it's interesting. I think it's one of the reasons I loved working in HR. And I when I found HR, it was the right thing for me. Because actually, I used to joke that HR was 90% talking to people and 10% being a complete bitch. And if someone at school in a careers offer had said to me, "We've got this perfect job for you, Amanda," I'd be like, "Yay, perfect!" Because I would actually, now, what I would say is that actually my role is about helping, and it sounds a little glib, but it's actually about helping people and organisations get the best. It's about really working with individuals and making sure that they have the tools and the resources and the situation to do the best that they can do, which then means that from a business, you are successful as a business. So it's still about advocating for people. It's still about helping people to have their voice. It's still about giving people access to services and the best that they can do. It's more about them as individuals than it is about access to health service, I suppose. So I'm still on that advocacy bent to a certain extent.
Okay. So when that voice inside your head says, you know, I'm not as successful as... Oh, you got a friend.
I have, sorry. There's a delivery.
That's all right, don't worry, it's fine.
Let me just put said friend down so he can go and chase and see what's downstairs.
No, that's all right.
Oh, apologies, he's gone.
No, don't worry. It's fine. I can't remember what I was saying now. Where was I going?
I got so distracted by the dog barking. We were talking about... I don't know.
So we came out of advocacy, and then I was going to say... So I said, in respect of the stories... Well, we'll go here then. So in respect to those stories that we tell ourselves then, so when you tell yourself that you're not, or when that voice inside your head tells you that you're not good enough, that you can't do this, or that you haven't got what you need, or you're not the right person, how does that feel? Which I know is a really broad question, but I'm going to run with it if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm not sure that I recognise that I'm doing it at the time that I do it.
Okay.
So I'm not sure I'm not sure it's until afterwards when I go, oh, I've been procrastinating quite a lot around this. Oh yeah, because actually I'm not good enough to do it. So yeah. I think it's, I think that it's a, so let me change this. So the feeling and the reaction that I'm not good enough actually isn't based on fact. Okay. And actually when you look at self-doubt and imposter syndrome and that kind of belief that it's not enough, it's usually contrary to any objective evidence that actually showed that you're actually quite talented and you actually are okay. And so I think I don't feel, because I think what I do is I find ways to avoid. So I am a procrastination master. I joke with my brother that actually I just need a bit of pressure to get my best work done. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I just think it's about the fact that the self-doubt in me goes, oh, that's going to be quite hard and I'm not sure that I'm good enough to do that. So, oh, look, there's a nice bit of a list that needs writing over here, or there's a kitchen that needs tidying, or there's a cake that needs baking, or a box set that needs watching, or actually if I can just play around with this piece of work over here, then I can avoid that bit over there that actually I am doubting whether I'm good enough or have the skill to do. So it's about confidence, and it's I don't know, is doubt a feeling? So yeah, it's, I don't know. Yeah, so it's doubt. It's about a lack of confidence in myself, and that self-doubt and that kind of fear of being found out that I'm not good enough at it, and I am and that actually I'm going to fail because I'm not good enough. But you know, then also I think procrastination is a bit of a coping mechanism, because if you procrastinate and then you fail, you can say, oh well, I failed because of lack of effort. Yeah. And then it's something else's fault. It's because of the procrastination, not necessarily because, or you know, you can turn it round that you can say, oh, I was lazy, or those sorts of things. So I think that it's doubt,
which then fulfills your story.
Exactly. Yeah. You can completely. You can fulfil your narrative. So I think that there is that. It's interesting because obviously we agreed to do this at kind of a 10 days ago, and I've been thinking a little bit about this since then. And I've been reading and looking at a couple of things since then, and looking at my behaviour. And it's interesting that that inner voice stuff that I don't always know if I believe in. So I read a lot of self-help books, and I listen to self-help podcasts and stuff. And a lot of times I find myself going, yeah, whatever, affirmations, blah, blah, blah. But actually, my inner critic and my inner voice, she's quite loud. And she's not always that nice. And she doesn't pull any punches with some of the things that she says. And so that has been quite an opening to me, an eye-opener for me, sorry. And it's having this conversation and thinking about it has kind of made me go, why am I saying that about myself? So one of the things that I do a lot is I say that I'm lazy.
Okay.
And actually, you go back and look at what you can achieve and what you have achieved and what you can do. And that wasn't the activity of a lazy person. That was actually someone getting stuff done. So what is it that what do I hide behind, and why do I call myself lazy? And it's not, I think as individuals, we're not always very nice to ourselves. And if I could find a way of not silencing that critic, but challenging her immediately and kind of taking it back a bit, I think I'll probably cope and get more stuff done, and perhaps procrastinate a little less.
Yeah, it's really. So I was doing some work last week with a group, and one of the things that we're playing with, like, this notion of leadership, because it's like this nebulous thing that nobody can ever really pin down or define, where you've got thousands and hundreds of thousands of different definitions of what it is, and the group are kind of sort of it's like a future leaders type program, sort of like a high potentially type thing. And I've been doing some work with them for a while on their identity. What is their identity as an individual, as a person, but also as a leader. So one of the things that I asked them to do last week was to dance with their inner critic, or what I call dance with your inner critic. So I put them into some thinking pairs, and I asked them to choose people that they trust and that they're comfortable with, and if anybody felt like they wanted someone else to talk with, then that it was okay to say, I don't want to talk with you, I want to talk to someone else. But my question that I sent them off into their thinking pairs with was, I could never be the leader I want to be because.
Oh.
And I deliberately kind of framed it as, I want you to allow I want you to give your inner critic a voice. I want you to give it a chance to advocate. I want you to give it the floor, give it some time and space for advocacy. And then I want you to then reflect on, so the process was, answer the question in your thinking pair. So one person thinks first and the other person does it. Write down whatever notes you want to write down. And then I asked them to reflect on what their previous kind of achievements or things that they've done or tasks that they've completed, and to kind of do a check and balance against what that inner critic says. And what a lot of people reported in the session was, it took me to a really horrible dark place when I did it, but actually that check and balances aspect afterwards really made me think about how valid a lot of those things that voice advocated really are. Because when I, to use your example of lazy, when I then look back at it, actually the things that I complete or the things that I've achieved aren't achieved by a lazy person, they're achieved by somebody working hard. So it was a really interesting thing to explore with them.
I think that's, and I think that we as individuals don't, well, I don't think life, gives you time for that, because you move from one thing to the next thing. But I think as HR practitioners and as people who develop individuals and work on leadership, I actually think developing those skills and developing that, listening to your inner critic, but also then addressing it and looking at it. I think that's something that to develop leaders is something really important. And I think it's beyond. It's about allowing that space for I don't know, and allowing that space for actually, how will I get there? And because I think culturally, when we look at leaders, and when you ask people about leaders, if they were honest, they'd say they expect leaders to know the answers to everything, to know it quickly, and to know what's right. Actually, I quite like the leaders who are prepared to go, I don't know. I've surrounded myself with people who do know, or I know where to find out. I quite like that space for I don't know, and that recognition that actually it's important to continue learning and those sort of things. But I think it's a challenge when you're developing through your career, because culturally we're expected to know. We're expected to know what's best. We're expected to be successful. We're expected to move things forward. And actually allowing that space for I don't know and discovering, I think is within business is something that we don't always do.
Well, I agree, but and I think kind of linked and in addition to that is the, you know, what do I want to say? So I suppose it's broadly, so I could be really kind of glib, like you said earlier on, and say, you know, emotion isn't allowed in the workplace unless you're happy. If you're happy, that's all right. Anything else isn't allowed. And again, I think as a sweeping generalisation, that's probably a step too far. But as a broad generalisation, I think it's probably fair. But within that, then comes the fear. I think the intrinsic fear within individuals to say, if I say I don't know, how am I going to be judged? How is that going to affect people's views and perspectives of me? But also, then you've got, well, if we're full of a business of people that don't know, are we ever going to get anywhere?
Yeah.
So I think there are some. I agree with you. There's some kind of cultural narratives that allow it to happen. And one of the big outputs for me for the session last week, one of the things that really resonated with me was somebody said, I thought it was only me that had a really loud voice. I thought the voice that I hear was really loud. I thought it was only in me. I didn't realise that all these people have it, but actually everybody in this room has it, and that has been a revelation for me. And I was like, okay, well, that was really great, because that, if that changes that perception or that narrative that it's only me that thinks I'm not good enough, or it's only me that challenges myself, or that really is harsh on or challenges myself, then that's a sort of a tick for something that's been achieved.
But that's one of the things about imposter syndrome, isn't it? You know, everybody else knows what they're doing and I don't. And I'm going to get found out because I don't know what I'm doing, but everybody else does. Whereas actually, there very few people live without self-doubt. I was listening to a podcast last week where, and I'm going to be a bit vague because I can't remember it, but I'll tell you the podcast afterwards.
That's right.
Where they quoted some research that showed that the least likely people to have imposter syndrome are senior professors in academia, senior people, men in health profession, and bankers. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of what we think about who those people are and what they do. Now, actually, I want a surgeon who doesn't experience self-doubt.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to know.
How do we?
I think I want someone who can be humble and who can be open to conversation, but when they've got their knife in their hand and they're about to cut in, I want them to be as sure as they can of their self, and I don't want them to think I don't want them to be there with a fear of being found out.
Okay.
There must be other professions that we want people to not have that fear of being found out. Driving instructor. Do we want people teaching people to drive who have a fear that actually they're rubbish drivers themselves?
Pilots.
That's a really good example. I want a pilot who is confident that no matter what the weather throws at them, actually they've been trained to be in that situation. But is this about giving people the skills and training to cope with that, or is it about an individual having that self-assurance and lack of self-doubt?
I get it. So there's a couple of things in that. So I think the humility is a big one. So what I wouldn't want is a surgeon that is so arrogant that nobody will tell them if they're doing the wrong thing or if they're concerned about something. So that humility is a big part of it. And again, since you mentioned earlier that you've been doing some thinking, some investigation, researchy type stuff, and I've been doing the same thing. In terms of those that, I found an article that talks about how those that have self-doubt are kind of humble with it. Sorry, those who have less self-doubt but are humble with it are more valued and appreciated as individuals than those that have no self-doubt but are arrogant and go with it. And I think, that kind of, there's an element of common sense that sits within that. Do I want a surgeon who's got self-doubt? I'm really hung up on that. Whether that's because of my operation last year or not, I don't know. But that's really got me thinking about, do I want a surgeon that's got self-doubt?
Or is it about the timing of that self-doubt? So one of the things about imposter syndrome is the way you behave up to that point that you're in the room. Yeah. So actually, a little bit of self-doubt up to the point that you're in the room, and let's talk about people who have to facilitate meetings. Yeah. There's often times when I've had to facilitate a group of leaders and I've thought, these people are all vastly more qualified than I am. I was on an executive team with a group of medical research professionals. Bulk of them are medical research professionals. In that room, we had 2 Knights of the Realm. We had a man who had won a Nobel Prize. We had a dame, and the great and the good from London academia in a room, and me, with no degree, a newly divorced, living off credit cards woman who was in the room. I could tell them about maternity law, but as soon as once they started getting into things, but could I get these people to make a decision? And actually, when I got in the room and I had to facilitate things, I realised that I was the right person for what they needed in that room at that time. The doubt leading up to that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because it made sure that I was prepared. It made sure that I had a real understanding of what we wanted to achieve. It made sure that I researched when I got into the room. And because I knew that I had these concerns, actually, I used that self-doubt and that imposter syndrome to make sure that I was ready. So that when I went into that room and I had no room for self-doubt anymore, because I had to facilitate whatever conversation we were having, I was able to do that in a way that worked for them and worked for me. So I think that you want a surgeon who double checks. You want a surgeon who does their research. You want a surgeon who continues to learn, doesn't think they know everything. But actually, when they're in that operating theatre with that scalpel, I don't think that's the time you want any self-doubt.
I now want to get a surgeon on the podcast. Sorry, I want to get you. Really think. All right, I want to get a surgeon on the podcast and talk to them about it. So I think as an individual, as a patient, I agree with you. I think that was a really good, summary of what I would like. And then, because again, it was really interesting. The hospital where I had my surgery. When I was going in for the scans beforehand, and even on the day of surgery and one day after, I think it was the day after, I was asked who my surgeon was, and when I said who it was, I was like, oh, he's a really good one. He's really great. And I was like, so there's multiple surgeons on the team, and we know there is because you've asked who's my surgeon, and the response I get is that, and I thought, that's really interesting. So what does that tell me about the other surgeons that are on that?
Well, exactly. What would you have done if they'd gone, oh well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry to hear you've got this person, and you really should have got this one. Or is it a stock answer? Because that's the other thing. We've got to put it in context in the hospital. Would a nurse or a physio or a porter or whoever else, would they say anything other than, oh, they're a really, really good one? Because actually, is it a part of a ritualised conversation that they have? So irrespective of the name that I should have done an experiment and given a different name, shouldn't I? Irrespective of the name that I said, would that have been the stock response? Is another possibility.
But that's quite interesting, isn't it? So there's been, I think it was the news this year, there was a surgeon who was prosecuted for branding organs with his initials.
Really?
Did you read about this? So
No.
I think it was kidneys. And he laser branded these kidneys with his initials. I will find you the article and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please do. So
add it to the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a lady that he treated afterwards who came out and said, "I don't care. He's the best surgeon who probably saved my life. And if he wants to put his initials on stuff because he's done this, I don't care because he's saving lives." And that really conflicted me because I'm like, how dare he? How dare he be so arrogant as to put his initials on someone's organ? But then there's this woman who's going, "I'm alive because of him. I don't care that he put his initials on me." That's a real, I don't know, I genuinely don't know how to feel about that. Because should this man who can save lives no longer be allowed to practice because his arrogance allowed him to put his initials on people's organs? I don't know. Do you save the fat man?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll tell you what then, because I want to segue back into something you said earlier on. So what I'll do is instead I'll say, listeners, let us know your thoughts. So you can, on Twitter or on the podcast comments or whatever, be interested to know your thoughts on should that surgeon not be allowed to practice anymore because they brand or they have been found to be branding organs with their initials for the work they've done.
Sorry, that took a bit of a weird turn.
No, it's fine. It's all right. No, it's really interesting. So before that, we were talking about how, when you were giving your example about the facilitating the meeting with the Knight of the Realm and the Dame and the Nobel Prize winner and so on, you talked about how the imposter syndrome actually helped you. So, because it helped you be prepared and thoroughly prepare and that sort of stuff. So what else, or how, let's go there. How do you work with your imposter syndrome now then? What do you do to sort of help you and sustain you through that or with that?
So it's really interesting. I think that, so I've been working for 26 years now. And in the last 5 to 7 years, I think I've really started to recognise my own expertise and kind of go, actually, this is what I'm good at and this is what I can do. Now, I still don't think I'm the best at those things and I still want to develop and learn and I still read, but I'm starting to kind of go, actually, I have an expertise in these areas. So I think that's part of it, and part of that is actually looking at what I've done, recognising what I've done, and actually recognising that it's okay to go, I'm good at this stuff. So I am good at being in a room with loads of people who want to talk around a subject and actually getting them to get to the subject and move that forward. What I'm not good is pampering people's egos and stroking egos and working around that, and as a result there are certain situations I'm not the best person for, but you kind of get to. I think the other thing that I do is I go into research mode. So if I am going to be working on something or I'm going to be looking at something, I have a habit of going into research mode. Okay. What I'm not, so I'll get books, I'll look at podcasts, I'll do a Google research, reviews, I'll look at articles and those sorts of things. So I use that doubt by going, well, actually, I need to be better informed. Because I think the information is, again, it sounds a bit glib, information is power. And actually, even if by reading all this stuff you come away going, I know less than I thought I did, or even actually now I've got more questions than I had, actually getting that information around. So a good example is I was doing some work on diversity and inclusion at work, and we were particularly looking at gender pay reporting the gender pay gap, and what organisations could do to address issues where they had issues around the gender pay gap. And whilst I had a personal interest and I have a bit of a campaigning mind when it comes to that sort of thing, I wanted to go and find some practical examples of what organisations could do to start addressing the gender pay gap. And I did that by doing a lot of research, and I came across some fantastic books and some fantastic articles out there, talk to people, find out things that people are doing. So it's I took what I felt in my guts might be the right thing to do and then back that up with some evidence. I'm terrible at quoting the evidence. I have to go, oh, such and such read a book, I'll send you the link because I never remember anyone's name. Yeah. But actually, I personally back up my assumptions by trying to go out there and get some facts. So that's one of the things I look at. Okay. The other thing that I've done recently, which I think is... I recommend to anyone, and I got it from a lady called Sass Petherick. Sass is someone who I worked with in the corporate world many, many years ago, and she took herself out of the corporate world and retrained as a coach, and she did a really heavy master's and actually did a lot of work around self-doubt in this. And so I'll share the in your show notes her link. She's at sathpetherick.com, and she also has another podcast called Courage and Spice. But one of the things that she talks about in Courage and Spice is actually understanding how vast you are, and kind of looking at the idea that you're beyond that one thing, that imposter syndrome and that self-doubt you have. And so she advocates this exercise where you spend about 15 minutes writing 100 words or phrases that describe you. So roles you play, things you like, think those special things that you do. And it could be anything like that special skill you have of making a crying child stop crying in an airport, or the way you knit wonky scarves and hats, or the way you can really drill into the detail of a particular issue at work and those sort of things. And it's kind of getting that whole roundness, so you really have an understanding of just how vast you are, and that whilst, yes, you have imposter syndrome and some self-doubt around this one thing, you're so much wider than this one thing. And that's been really helpful for me, because I for many years I felt that without my work and without that success at work, I wasn't entirely sure who I was, and I wasn't entirely sure about how I could be successful and happy, and it felt very much about I had to be successful at work and I had to be doing this to be successful and happy. And actually, in the last couple of years, I've realised that having a proper kitchen disco and a laugh with my other half, Anthony, brings me so much more joy than completing a piece of work. I want to do both really well. I want to enjoy both really well, and I want to be successful at both. But actually, one isn't worth less than the other. I mean, I used to put work and my success at work above everything else, and that was how I defined myself. Yeah. And I just don't do that anymore. And that's been a real shift in how I cope with not feeling good enough in a lot of areas. That my house is never clean enough. My weight is never the right number. My dogs are never tidy enough. There is never enough food in my cupboard, or there's food, but it's always the wrong kind of food. My to-do list is very rarely completely done. There's always going to be other stuff to do. But actually, I am so much more than my to-do list. I'm so much more than that one piece of work I'm doing right now. And knowing that, I think, has really helped me cope with this imposter syndrome. But as you know, from conversations we'd had in the last week, it hasn't gone. I still go, well, why would Phil want to talk to me? I don't know anything. But actually, that discovering how vast I am, and I'm not that vast, I don't have any particular skill that a lot of people have. I don't play any instruments. I'm not, I haven't climbed any mountains. But even little old me, I'm doing all right.
Yeah. And you make me smile as you said that, because it's as soon as you said it, I was like, oh look, that's a bit of the imposter syndrome talking. I've not climbed any mountains. I've not done any of these things. But yeah.
Yes, because that's what success is, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Success is climbing mountains or raising money or whatever. So one of the things that I wanted to ask was, because if somebody Googled Amanada Arrowsmith, they might find things like, especially if they were searching on social media, they might find things like an Ignite talk that you gave at a conference called NAP, or the CIPD's Northern Area Partnership, in 2017, where you essentially do some singing poetry, and they might look at that and go, how on earth does that person, they might not kind of compute the two things together in terms of you saying, this is something that I've really struggled with over time, I've worked really hard to get better at, and they kind of see that as an action. They might not equate the two together. So I was wondering, like, for something like that Ignite Talk as an example, how do you prepare for that? What's the kind of, I get there's the over research bit maybe, but how do you kind of work with the imposter syndrome stuff to then come out with something as amazing, and as amazing as that Ignite Talk was?
So I've been a couple of things. One is I have been practicing accepting compliments, which I know sounds ridiculous. Practice the violin, you practice tennis. I've been practicing accepting compliments. So thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I don't mean that. I'm like, oh my God, people
You're
actually
welcome.
see that, and that's available on the internet.
It was amazing. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to be completely honest. And I apologise, Gemma and Kez, in advance. I was asked last minute to do the Ignite Talk. Someone had pulled out. Oh, I tell you what it was. Do you remember we had the Snap election called that year? And Joe Swinson was meant to be doing the keynote speech. And unfortunately, Joe was standing as a Member of Parliament, and Nap was on the day and the day after the election. So Joe could no longer do the keynote speech. So 5 weeks before NAP, all of a sudden, they had no keynote speaker anymore. So the committee at NAP rushed around, found some people who would do some Ignites, and myself, Gary Cookson and David said, yeah, sure, we'll do it. And so for 4 weeks, I did nothing. I went, I'm doing that talk at NAP. I wonder what I'm going to do. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm doing that talk at NAP. Oh, it's only 5 minutes. It'll be fine. What am I going to do? Oh, yeah. And for 4 weeks, I did nothing. And then I had this idea at night, one night, where I thought, I wonder if I could do like a little bit of a song and a slide with each song. And then Jem and Kez asked me for my slides, and I went, yeah, they're coming. Yeah, they're coming. Yeah, they're coming. I finally finished my presentation on the train on the way up that morning.
Okay.
I ran it through for the first time at the racecourse that afternoon with our good friend Julie, who, bless her, said to me, have you run through this before? And I went, yeah, once or twice. I lied to one of my best friends. And she said, yeah, you might just want to slow down a bit and check the lyrics on some things. I think Julie knows very well that I was lying. She knows me very well. I ran it through 3 times before I got up on that stage and did it. Now, I'd had the idea some time before, and I'd thought about it in my head some time before, but I'd procrastinated so much that I didn't actually put it down onto paper until I had no choice other than to put it down on paper. And then I took a deep breath and I jumped in and I got away with it. But I loved it. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I realised that I enjoy standing up and singing in front of people. It's something that I've done from a very young age. There's a newspaper article that my mother has from the Newbury Weekly News when I was 12 that says that I was a miniature hybrid Liza Streisand. Oh yes, I was I was a diva, it's fair to say. But I was a diva who wasn't good enough because her brother got the leading part. And I didn't get a part in The Sound of Music, but my brother and my best friend did. And my brother was Oliver. And so even though I love doing these things, actually, I was never good enough. So, so yeah, how did I get up and do it? I didn't give myself a choice other than, but also I went to something that I know I'm comfortable at and I know I'm good at. And I know that I can stand up and sing in front of people. Because actually, it's something I've always done. And so I found something that worked for me.
And so that procrastination that led up to it then, was that back to something you talked about earlier on, which is if I don't do it, then I don't have to. Then if I don't do it, then the voice won't tell me that I'm not good enough and I can't do that. And what a stupid bonkers idea!
Completely.
So if I leave it to the last minute, I've made a promise to these people. Now all these people are going to be waiting. So my only option is to kind of deliver,
exactly,
irrespective of what that voice says.
Yeah, and if you ignore something long enough, then you put it in that box over there, You can ignore it and you don't have to worry about it, do you? I think it's really interesting because I think that you can equate this back to lots of different things in work and in life. So in work, you don't get that report written until you have to, and you end up staying up till 5 o'clock in the morning, or you end up working till 9 o'clock at night and then getting up again at 4 o'clock in the morning, which I have done. And I've done with writing, I've done with bid work, I've done in the last few years when I have tried to write something and just looked at a blank screen, and it hasn't been until those last 24 hours that my brain and my body has gone, it's too late, you have to do this. And so that fear comes in and you get it written. But then I think that there's also an element in life, you know, I have... I wrote a blog this week about the menopause because, you know, that's fun. And but one of the things I mentioned in there is I've lived in this house now for 7 months and I still don't have a GP. I know I need a GP. Okay. I know I need to get it done. But it's one of those things that I hate going to the doctor. Can't be bothered going to the doctor. It's not something we do as Arrowsmiths. You know, when I fell over at school when I was very young, and they phoned my mother and said... well, there was two things. So the first one was they phoned her and said, oh, Amanda's sick. And she said, has she been sick? And they said, no. And she said, well, call me when she's been sick. And then the second one was Linda, Amanda's broken her arm. And she said, are you sure? And they said, yes, we're really sure she's broken her arm. And she's like, oh, okay. So, you know, as a family, that's the way that we work. And so it's almost that you put things off until they become something you have to do, and often to your own detriment. And I think that people do it all the time. I think you look at people who have skin cancer. It's a really good example. They've got a mole, they know it's itchy, they know it's uncomfortable, they know it's probably changed shape a bit, but they do nothing about it for several months. Actually, it's something that can be fixed really quickly, but it's one of those things that and I don't know what it is about us as humans that we ignore those difficult things. But we ignore them, and we ignore them sometimes to our own detriment. So far, I've been lucky. So far, I procrastinate and then I get stuff done and it gets out there and it's been okay, or it's been good even. But I know it's it's something I need to deal with and do less of.
Cool. So I think, so thank you. And I think one of the things that we, as humans, we're good at is catastrophizing.
Oh yeah.
And then we don't like catastrophe, so then we put it in a box and try not to think about it and address it. And you know, I mentioned that I think in the podcast, the one that I did that kicked off the year, that you know I didn't want to look at myself in a mirror because if I did, I had to admit that there was something wrong, and if I admit there was something wrong, then that got really scary, and I didn't want to do that. So actually, I'll put paper over glass, and I'll not look at myself walking down the street. I won't look at my reflection in the window type thing. So I think because if you then think about when I remember a similar thing when I did my Ignite at the L&D show in May last year, and when I did that in a poetry way, that was scary. And like you, lots of practice, but it was lots of practice in the last week, few days leading up to it, as opposed to practicing it for weeks and 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 weeks.
I think sorry. Just as a slight tangent, I personally think that Ignites benefit from that. So I find those Ignites that are over practiced and that they've done before, or that they're just selling what they're always selling. I haven't enjoyed those as much as the ones where it's for that event or for that thing. So the ones that you and I did at that L&D show, I loved your Ignite. I loved the way that you built in the pauses and built in that time and the way that you had written it for that event. I thought it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. There were others on that bill that you could tell it was something they'd done before and they just brought out every time they were asked to do something. And I think that one of the power of the Ignite series is actually they are always about in that moment, and because of the pressure of the slides moving on and the way that it works. So the Disrupts HR series, which I think there's been 6 of them now in the UK. In London, I know they've got some in Glasgow. I quite like the fact that they tend to have different speakers all the time, and a lot of times it's people's first time doing those ignites, and the energy that you get from that nervousness is fantastic. It's the same sort of thing you get from improv. If you go and look at improv and the way that people work around improv, it's fantastic, and you get the opportunity to see how people work and what they do. I think it's really interesting, and really, I think it's a real skill that people can get, and I think that there's some stuff around improv that's quite interesting to use in work, and I think some of the skills that people get from theatre and improv could be really interesting in the workplace as well. Sorry, slight tangent.
No, it's all right. So I think again, for me, it links back into, because if what often, so my inner critic often sort of tells me the voice that I have within me, says things like, you can't do that, you're not good enough to do that, you're not prepared enough to do that. So actually, something like improv, where you don't have that opportunity to prepare, then gives you a, and again, this works for some people, doesn't work for others in terms of the translation across the workplace. But to be able to say, you know what, I can create something off the top of my head that makes sense. It might not be perfect, it might not be 100% on point, but I can create something off the top of my head that works and makes sense. Because then if you have that build up of evidence of experiences where you do that, then it just makes you more and more confident to do other things in the future. One of my habits, and one of the things I'm known for, is if I ring somebody and they send me to their voicemail, the message I'll leave will be in song.
Yes.
So it will be a version of a song, but with the message tailored to whatever the reason I was calling for. And so part of it is because I enjoy it. I enjoy the challenge. I enjoy the challenge of, right, can I make up a song on the spot for this person about why I rang? Because if I can, it gives me the confidence and the reassurance that actually, if somebody chucks something at me left field, I've got the wherewithal within me to respond to that, and respond quickly and in a way that makes sense. And sometimes that the songs are good, and sometimes they're less good, but either way it's okay. I can kind of work with it and make sense of it. Okay, so I'm conscious of time.
I know.
and I want to start to sort of put it together. So we talked about sort of strategies that help you. One being the how vast I am. Another one being using it to prepare you. Are there any other strategies or any other things that really help you when working with your inner critic / imposter syndrome?
I think the research thing is it comes from the make space for I don't know. So it's all right to go, actually I don't know enough about this, and to find out. I think that I talked about recognising your expertise. It's okay to go, do you know what, that's the area that I'm good at, and that's my area of expertise. I think we need to celebrate success more. I think sometimes in work, we're so busy moving on to the next thing, improving ourselves, that we actually don't stop and celebrate the success. And I think that as managers, as leaders, as individuals, we're all guilty of that. And we need to find some way of just having that 24-hour rule where you're allowed to be really pleased with something that you've done. And I think the other thing that I would recommend to anyone who has experienced a bit of self-doubt is go back and look at what you've done. Go back and appreciate what you've done. I recently went back and read the first bid that I did for something. And I've done a couple of them over the years. And I went back and I read it, and I came away and kind of went, oh, that was actually quite good. You wrote some good stuff in there. Because I'd become a bit stuck, and I'd become a bit unsure that I was good enough to write what I needed to write, and I couldn't have the ideas and it wasn't flowing. And so I went back and read things that I had written and read things that I'd said and the research that I'd done. And I came away going, I can do this, and I reminded myself. So I think Gemma Dale went to a lecture at Manchester.
Yeah, that's right.
Last week around imposter syndrome, and one of the things that the lecturer suggested was you put a brag list together. Now, I'm not going to put a brag list together because that's far too American for me. I'm far too British, and we shall never have a brag list. But I think that it's important to look at your achievements beyond your CV. And actually sometimes that's about going back and reading a particularly good piece of work you wrote, going back and looking at a workshop that you developed that was really good, looking at things that you've done, no matter how far back, and actually going, oh, I can do this, and that's good. And I think that is a real skill to come back to. It comes back to how vast you are, but I think this is particularly around in your work life. If you are
in your work life,
questioning your ability, go back and look at things that you've done, because you can do it and you have done it. You just need to sometimes remind yourself. And I think that's really powerful, that reminding yourself you can do it.
Yeah.
If you think about children and riding bikes and falling off bikes, actually they can't do it until they do. And then your brain kind of clicks, doesn't it? That I can ride a bike, or I can do this. And it's that confidence that comes with knowing. So I think that as adults we lose that sometimes. And I think we have to go back and get that confidence that comes with knowing. And I think the only other thing I would say, and it sounds a little bit glib, but there's that very well-known saying that comparison is the thief of joy. And it really is. And I am terrible at comparing myself to other people and going, well, why did they choose her to do that? Or why did they choose him to do that? Because surely I'm better, and surely I've got this experience. No, look, there they go. And actually, it's not about them, and I shouldn't be comparing myself to anyone else. I don't practice everything that I preach, by the way. I'm working on it, and I'm working on myself towards that. But I think that we as a society need to stop comparing ourselves to other people, and we need to find out what my happy is and what my right is.
I went swimming last week, and there was a lady who was swimming in the lane next to me, and I just had like this real strong thing about comparing the quality of my swimming stroke with hers, because she just looked effortless as she swam through the water. And I was like, right, I'm gonna be effortless, and I just wasn't. And I in my head, I was imagining myself as like this flailing, swimmer who was splashing everybody and weaving across the lane or whatever. And I had to, when I stopped for a rest after a few lengths, I was like, right, come on, stop. That's not helping you in any way, shape or form. If you want to compare yourself, just compare yourself with you, and compare yourself with how you were last week or the week before that or the week before that. And look, is that getting, what were you achieving then and what you're achieving now versus as compared to, this lady, for all you know, she could swim, every day of the week, and she's been practicing for 20 years, and you're then trying to go, oh, look at me, I'm trying to compare myself. So
I had a yoga session with Daisy. She's on Instagram as Farm Girl Yogi, on Thursday last week, and I booked for a class, and actually I was the only one that turned up for the class, so I ended up having this fantastic one-to-one yoga session. But we had a long conversation about downward dog and how you get into a particular position for downward dog, and how your hips and your back need to be aligned, and getting your feet down and that sort of thing. And so Daisy is paid to be a yoga instructor. This is what she does for her living. She said to me, oh, Amanda, for 3 years I couldn't get my feet flat. It took me 3 years to get this pose right. You are further along now, I can't get my feet flat, than I was after 18 months. So the important thing about that yoga session is whenever you go into practice, it's your practice and it's for you, and what you're doing is right for you. And what you can do this week might be different to what you do next week, but we are each different. We each go at our own pace, and actually comparing yourself to someone else isn't going to make you better. Aspiration is good, inspiration is good, but comparison is actually just going to knock you back a bit. Says the beautiful, lithe 27-year-old girl as she's bending around in front of me as I'm struggling to get my hands over my toes. But she meant well, bless her.
No, I know what you mean. But I think it's another one of the things that create the I'm not worthy, and I don't belong here, because you've got all these other people that have these things or do these things or achieve these things. So it is back to that comparison, in terms of what because by making that comparison, you then you imply or presuppose or actually outwardly state that I am not as good as that person, and so I agree with you. It's something that actually can debilitate an awful lot more than it can be of any use to individuals. Okay, so there was one thing I also wanted to add to where you said earlier on about going back and reviewing your work and reviewing your successes. I agree with all of that. One of the things that I did was when I made my list of the stuff that I said I wasn't good enough at, I went back and did that check and balance thing that I talked about earlier on. But I also got somebody who I really trust, who I gave them my list as well, and said, I want you to tell me what you think. I want you to do a check and balance for me. For you to tell me whether you think any of these are, kind of what evidence do you have to support or challenge that these things exist. And I found that a really useful thing to do. I found that really helpful to get, as well as having my own perspective, to get someone else's perspective on it as well, because they shared with me things that I hadn't really noticed or hadn't paid attention to, but they're like, there's this thing that you do or this thing that happens that actually makes a real difference to me or to your work or to the organisation or whatever it is. So I find that quite a useful thing to do. Granted, it was someone that I trusted implicitly, because I wouldn't want to just give it away to anybody.
But I think that's something that we can do, isn't it? We can do both in work but also in life, is that actually, and it comes back to the celebrating success, it's okay to tell people that you think they're really good at something. It's okay. It's good to say, I really value your opinion on this. I think that you did this really well. And it's not patronising and it's not condescending. It's actually celebrating success. And it comes back to accepting compliments, doesn't it? Like I said earlier, it's like, I'm teaching myself to accept compliments, and I really am.
Yeah, as opposed to dismissing them.
Yeah, because normally my first reaction was, that was nothing. I winged it. But actually, I'm really grateful that someone enjoyed it and that it went well. And it's it's allowing yourself to recognise someone else and recognise your value through someone else, which is a whole different podcast that you'll have to have that conversation with someone about.
Yeah. Okay, I'll add that one. I'll add that. That gives me a nice link. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but I'll take it. So, is there any guests that you would recommend that, or any future suggestions for other stories we should explore?
I think that taking compliments thing and the emotion around other people's recognition is quite an interesting thing, particularly in a work environment, because there's the whole thing about letting people down and disappointing people, but then there's the other side of actually accepting praise and accepting that you've done something. So I think that's quite interesting, that feeling. I think that there's always something around the language that we use. So I find it amusing when people in work tell people that they're disappointed in them. To which my general response is, well, that's nice. Because actually this wasn't about whether you are disappointed in something that I've written, because guess what? I didn't write it for you. And so I think that's always interesting, that the use of language and the power behind language and how that flips into work. So I think that would be good. Future guests, there's some great people. I'd love to hear you talk to a surgeon about doubt. I think that would be amazing. If you can find one to talk to about doubt, I think that'd be really interesting. I think that's I think that's fascinating. I think the other thing that's always interesting is people that have changed careers and not necessarily downsize their careers, but people who've changed careers. So I'm always really interested with people who were kind of successful bankers and those sort of things, who then go into public service. So there's a lady, I'll send you her name separately because I've forgotten it. She's a chief inspector in the Scottish Police, who used to be a banker in the city, and she's now a chief superintendent in Police Scotland. Rose, someone will come back to me. I think she'd be fascinating to kind of that, because they're completely different, aren't they?
Completely different, yeah, absolutely.
And those people who go from being bankers to being teachers, again, completely different. So I think those sorts of people would be incredibly interesting.
Okay, all right, I shall do that then. Thank you. I'll add that to the list of guests to source. All right. So to bring us to a close then, with my usual closing question, is there anything else then, the lovely Amanda Arrowsmith, that you are thinking, feeling, or want to say on the topic of emotion at work in imposter syndrome?
I think that one thing we didn't touch on, and it's quite a big thing, but I think that imposter syndrome is sometimes seen as a woman's problem, and it's therefore used as a label for women. But it's really important that we as employers know that it's not just about women. It's about that cultural pressure to perform and not show weakness. And I think that sometimes that's harder for men. And I think that within HR, it's important for us to recognise that and to think about that. I guess the only other thing I would say is that this isn't always about achieving and succeeding. Actually, failure is okay, and it's how you recover from that failure and how you get back that is important. Failure itself is a learning experience, which I know is easy to say, but as someone who has failed spectacularly several times, actually you do learn from it, and it's how you find a way of not allowing that to eat at you and become the evidence for your imposter syndrome. So the evidence that you're not enough and the evidence that you're a fraud, and actually balancing that. So as you were saying, your list of what you're good at or what you think you're not good at, you need to balance that. So those would be the big things for me. But also I think that you've talked about emotion at work, and emotion isn't a bad thing. I think we think about emotion and we think about tears and we think about, oh my God, I can't cope with people crying. That's not what we mean. And actually it can be joy, it can be fear, it can be anger, it can be authenticity, it can be all these different things. And I think it's important that we allow those in the workplace. And working in HR, we have a unique position to allow that and to enable that. And we should use that position as best we can.
Yeah, I agree. I can't say anything more than I agree. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, just linking on a couple of things you said there. So one is I found some research around is imposter syndrome unique to women, and actually the data suggests no. It's just that often it's targeted at women more because it seems like societally or culturally it's more acceptable for women to say that they struggle with it, whereas men it's not, which is supporting the point that you just said, and I'll put a link to that research in the show notes as well.
Cool.
So thank you so much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. So yeah, we'll bring it together to a close. So thank you very much, Amanda Arrowsmith.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, written, recorded and presented by Phil Wilcox, edited together by Simon Leverton. You can find more information at emotionatwork.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at @PhilWilcox. Thanks for listening.